Well, welcome. I'm delighted to be back at FAIR. Bill Barouski, Chief Information Risk Officer, Northern Trust. I'm based in Chicago, but have a long and fond memory of FAIR. I used to be on the Institute. I was on the board, and I'm delighted to be back. So thank you for having me back. You're in for a treat today. We have Kevin Greenfield, who is the Director for Bank Information Technology with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Kevin's going to join us on screen momentarily, and I'm going to have him introduce not only what he does, but his interest in the subject. And then we have a very informal chat that we have with Kevin today. Please submit your questions through the chat session, and we'll be delighted to respond to those. So without further ado, let me introduce Kevin Greenfield and have him give a brief intro of himself.
No, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I'll start off with, actually I'm in a new role now. I am the Deputy Comptroller for Operations Risk with the OCC, and basically what that means is my team is responsible for drafting guidance and examination programs and such as it relates to all areas of operation risk, focusing on payment systems, critical infrastructure, bank information technology, and cybersecurity, as well as general governance and operational risk principles. I've been with the agency nearly 30 years. The majority of that time has been out in the field, starting off as a financial examiner, then moving into an IT specialist role, and in our large bank group, spending 14 years focused on some of the largest banks in the United States, their IT and operational risk frameworks. And now for the past 6 years, I've been in policy, formerly as the BIT Policy Director, and now as the Operations Deputy Comptroller for Operations Risk.
Well, Kevin, welcome. I must tell you, I went searching for information about you earlier and found a bio when you had been 15 years with the agency, and you haven't changed a bit. So, so delighted to have you. So this is new. This is new for me. I know you've been doing a few of these, Kevin. The entire virtual conferencing really belies the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's constantly evolving. It's challenging leaders. We have undeniable unpredictability, imperfect information, and we need to identify responses pretty quickly and make decisions pretty swiftly and completely. Brings into really conversation operational risk. So my first question for you is, from your perspective, regulatory perspective, is it even important more now than ever for banks to prioritize operational risk?
Absolutely. Operational risk is one of the key foundations for the safety and soundness, not only of individual banking institutions, but of the overall U.S. banking system. And it's something we're very focused on. And your references to the COVID-19 pandemic response is a good reference for. We have been very focused on the concepts of operational resilience and taking an all hazards approach to looking at operations risk. What are the threats? What are the mitigants? And what are the responses? And I think an example of the banking industry having a good operational resilience framework is how quickly the industry pivot from an in-person, everyone in the office, people coming into branches and offices, to within a few weeks moving to a near virtual environment where there is very limited access to physical offices by customers, and then the majority of your workforce working in a virtual environment. And even for those that are in operational centers, having to work under social distancing frameworks. And I think it speaks very highly of the operational resilience of the U.S. industry, of the U.S. banking industry, and how quickly that pivot was made.
You know, for ourselves, I know as the industry, you're right. In many ways, I think the industry even impressed itself with the ability to be this resilient, where everyone now is working on a tethered VPN, a remote office, and having to adapt to a lot of unusual circumstances. Let me shift a little bit away from the COVID-related op resilience and talk, as you try and measure things, Kevin, a lot of times we use qualitative risk measurements to give a sense of whether it's operational resilience. Do you see that being more recognized by regulators, or are you still insisting on, more of the hard school quantitative?
I think both have their place in a risk management framework. One should be used to complement and support the other. Without a doubt, hard metrics over meeting service level agreements, operational uptime, number of outages or incidents, and the recovery time period are very important, but also looking at some of the qualitative measures of what is the internal assessment of the strength of controls. What are the reads on the results of business continuity testing, not just from were we able to recover, but what were the strengths, what were the opportunities for improvement. And at the end of the day, somebody does need to make a qualitative call of, is this strong? Is this satisfactory? Is this just medium or fair? Or is it less than satisfactory in our areas for improvement? So I firmly believe you have to look at both qualitative as well as quantitative metrics and make your assessments. And I think it's very important that there be clear transparency of how you arrived at those decisions using both factors for executive management and the board to be able to clearly establish risk appetite for the firm.
Kevin, do you see boards of directors asking, from your perspective, for more quantitative assessment?
I think absolutely they want quantitative assessments as well, again, as well as qualitative, but I think with the quantitative assessments, not throwing just numbers upon numbers at them, it's what is the overall management's assessment and how are the numbers supporting that, and how can they see the trends and the transparency of something's a high risk. Why is it a high risk? If it's low risk, how did you arrive at that in a manner that's consistent and understandable for the board? So again, it's not just the quantitative, but using the quantitative with the qualitative qualitative assessment in order to clearly communicate and support and provide transparency. And the one thing I would emphasize to the group here when working with executive and management and board members, 300-page reports are not going to be effective. How do you get to what do the numbers mean? And I think that's very important in being able to communicate with management and the board, because I know for many of us that have grown up or dealt with the numbers firsthand or with the systems and the operational controls, we're very embedded in it. But again, being able to put it in a perspective that not only executive management and board can understand, but then they can compare to other risk decisions within the bank, whether it be credit, whether it be compliance, whether it be balance sheet management.
You're giving us a very nice sense of how regulatory or the top risk assessments for organizations have evolved over time. I mean, are there any other characteristics for the group today where you've seen this evolution? Shorter, more quantitative, not 300 pages, we got that. What else are you seeing?
Again, I wouldn't say just the quantitative side, but the assessment of what those numbers mean. And I think that's the most important thing, is that transparency and explanation of how you arrived at the assessment, and that's clear and digestible by a management group and group of directors that really do have to absorb a lot of information from different aspects of the risk profile of the bank. So I think really what we've seen in that evolution is providing that explanation or detail that's then supported by consistent numbers that they can see how you got there or how you arrived at it, and how it compares to other risks.
Do you find that in your experience with some of the largest institutions, if not in the US, in some cases in the world, what's your insight on what directors are looking for? You've given us brevity, you've given us, prove it, high or low, give us some quantitative assessment. What are some of the more probing questions that you're seeing directors ask in this area?
It's also actionable information. You've drawn me a picture. What am I supposed to do with it? What are the key decisions that need to be made? I think that's very important, is not just providing information with just, here's a background of what this is and how we got there, but this is what it means, and these are the decisions that need to be made by executive management and the board. And I think that's very important, that it be provided in a framework of this is what it means and these are the decisions that need to be made, and providing them with, again, then that transparency to allow them to make that decision. But just, again, data without any framework or purpose is just a lot of pretty graphs and numbers. It's what are the decisions that need to be made.
So, Kevin, I know you're familiar with the FAIR model. You're familiar with it as a standard risk measurement. How do you see such a measurement being incorporated at institutions to help them tell the story?
Sure. And I think at the start, as a regulator, I can't promote any framework one over another. So I'm very neutral as to what model or framework is used by an institution. It's more a matter of how effective it is. And I think that's the most important thing, is for any model, is consistent approach that has demonstrated effectiveness in communicating a risk picture to management and the board. And so really looking at your framework is, at the end, how does it arrive at the intended outcome, that the information has been presented in a consistent and transparent and representative fashion to management and the board to allow them to make those decisions, and that it's really painting a picture of where has the institution been, what have been the trends, to help predict where it's going.
I assume by you saying consistent, regardless of what your methodology is or model, that you're not changing the language with the board frequently, where you try to compare similar measurement over time.
Sure. And by this is, I always like to say, institutions should always reevaluate and see where the bar is and make decisions, very informed decisions on when to move it. But by the same token, if that bar is constantly moving, then you really don't have a measure. So it's not that it stays static and doesn't change at all, but it needs to be thoughtful and, again, with the purpose, and allow for, again, that clear measurement over time, and allow you to be informative to help inform the future direction of the institution. And that's why I always say it's not just the metrics. There are qualitative factors that, just because things have operated this way for the past 12 months doesn't mean, and I think COVID-19 is a good example. Let's face it, there are going to be a lot of operational metrics that have changed dramatically because the operating environment we're in has changed dramatically.
So with that, I like that transitory statement. Let's turn to you as an expert, as a regulatory expert. And when an organization presents you with their justification for a risk assessment or an appetite, tolerances, what do you expect, or how do you challenge back? Is it similar to the way you think a board of directors challenges, or is it different?
It's exactly from the standpoint of, we expect the board to provide credible challenge to management's decision. And as a regulator, that's what we come in and do as well, is how have you arrived at your assumptions? How have you ensured that your metrics have stayed consistent, or where you've made changes? it's clear and transparent. And again, understanding what is it telling you from the standpoint of the decisions that need to be made, and basically, is it informing the correct outcomes? And every bank will make different decisions based on their business model, their philosophy, and their risk appetite. But there should be clear, this is how we arrived and made those decisions. Understanding, again, where the risks are, how they've been measured, how they've been tested and validated of, is it giving you the right information? And then how have you looked at qualitative factors that may change that? And I'll give a good example of when looking at risks within the payment systems, look at historical, but that world is changing and changing very rapidly with faster real-time payments, new innovative delivery channels through mobile devices, looking at using distributed ledger technologies. That's going to change what are some of the risk decisions that the institution's going to be making. And there really is not historical data or hard numbers to support that, but you can't turn a blind eye to the world is changing and changing very rapidly.
And believe me, it's changed very differently than certainly when I started in this business, and maybe even since you started. But say a word on testing. What is really good testing look like?
So one, checking the accuracy and validating the integrity of the data that's supporting your reporting. Models, a lot of organizations use modeling techniques, and we can get into a very long discussion about use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in risk management. But again, how do you either validate those models or test and validate that the outcomes that it's working as intended? And so doing that kind of testing to make sure the sources and assumptions going into these metrics are on solid ground, and then validating against the outcomes, and always, again, going back and looking at the decisions being made on the metrics being presented. If it's not providing the right outcome, go back and look at the data. Go look at how you've measured your risk, and is it accurate, and is it reflective of today's operating environment, or more importantly, what that operating environment will look at like in 6, 12, 18, go out as many years as you're projecting.
And as good as those estimates or testing or modeling is, you still are surprised. I mean, we were all surprised earlier this year in an environment that impacted all of us. One of the most challenging aspects I saw a McKinsey survey recently, and it really talked about the challenge of supply chain management. And I know you're a bit of an expert, but the audience probably wants to hear your views. It's increasingly and perhaps even more dominantly highlighted during our recent experience with COVID, our dependency on each other, our dependency on supply chains outside of banking as well, for all of our personal lives. And the application or quantification against third-party supply chain management, do you have advice for the participants today?
Sure, I can share some of my experience, but I could also let you know some of the discussions we're having internally, because third-party risk management and supply chain management is a challenge. It's a challenge for financial institutions. It is a challenge for the service providers or third-party providers that are working to help support your organizations. So, I mean, from my perspective is, again, understanding what service is being delivered and looking at it from two perspectives. What is the criticality of that operation to the institution? And by that, I mean, if the service were to be interrupted or disrupted in any manner, will it have an adverse impact upon the bank's ability to deliver the bank's services to your customers? And then determine its criticality. but as well as looking at what is the risk associated with the type of service. And that seems like that should be mutually inclusive, or it is mutually inclusive, but it should be all inclusive. And it's not. And what I mean by that is there are some services that an institution may be receiving that really, if it was disrupted, it's not going to disrupt the operation of the bank, but there are other risks that need to be managed. Otherwise, it could have an adverse impact. And by that is, let's face it, if there's a third party providing payment systems, it goes down, the bank's going to have difficulty operating. There's going to be an adverse impact. That needs to be a key area of focus. Other areas may not be as risky and don't need that same area of focus, but just ensure you're not missing risks that, hey, this third party is providing marketing services, not critical, but they're basing their analysis on confidential, sensitive, and for customer information you've provided them. If that gets breached or gets stolen, that's a risk back to the bank, because ultimately it's the bank's breach of that information through their third party. Same thing with looking at other aspects, such as you partner with someone for add-on services and for provides an additional revenue source, not critical to the operation, but if that customer is not dealing, or if that provider is not dealing fairly with customers, that puts the bank at risk for potential consumer compliance issues. So just understanding what the risks are. One of the challenges we've very much been looking at is, how do we get more streamlined or standardized due diligence and information and ongoing monitoring of some of these firms that they may have 300 bank customers delivering similar services? How do we streamline that so that there doesn't need to be 300 individual independent assessments? And how can the industry work better together to streamline some of those processes to reduce burden on the individual institutions, as well as streamline things to allow for quicker and faster adoption of some of these third parties? And that's something we've been discussing, because there's a high threshold for safety and soundness expectations in the banking industry. And those high thresholds or high bars are there for a reason, because of the criticality of the banking industry. But how do we look to maintain those, but streamlining some of these processes? And that's something we've been very focused on, and definitely invite your members to speak with their primary regulators about those.
Kevin, what you outlined is one of the most difficult aspects of due diligence and the industry due diligence. And kudos to you and your other fellow regulators for harmonizing security guidance so that we start to respond to a common profile. Do you see something similar either within the industry? I know the industry has not been terribly successful at this, but do you see something from the regulatory bodies that might start to unify due diligence within some of the larger service providers? You said in payments or other critical providers to financial services.
We definitely have been talking with each other on how to better coordinate and align our existing third-party risk management guidance among the banking agencies, and we're working towards that. Something I would tell your members is that the FDIC, one of our fellow regulators, put out a request for information about this very issue, about is there a better way or certification process that can be stood up with the industry with regulatory support. And again, would encourage your members to provide feedback. Unfortunately, I don't remember what the due date for comment is, but that's something that's out there. And we are very much looking at how can we better align our guidance. How can we help set up a framework that allows industry to better harmonize or standardize this? And the one thing I'll say is there's not going to be a magic bullet from the standpoint of each service is going to be unique to the bank. Each year going to have some challenges there, which each bank having specific needs. But it's kind of the 80-20 rule is If 80% is common and we can address that, it will make that 20% that's unique much less resource intensive to manage. And that's something we're very supportive of. We'd like to see the industry very much move in this direction. And again, talking about how can we best support that as banking regulators, but again, maintaining those same safety and soundness expectations.
Okay. Last question on this subject for you.
Sure.
How I'm fascinated by it. Do you see the management of supply chain being changed or, because of its importance, escalated or elevated within the risk management function within some of your regulated entities?
I think it's a very important part. It's going to vary among institutions, but more and more as we see the specialization of services and that a lot of organizations are looking to third-party providers, again, looking to the fintech market for support and partnership in delivering some of these specialized products and services, using new innovative technologies. Again, cloud computing has definitely opened up a lot more opportunities for those types of partnerships that, yeah, very much that we see that there is going to be a lot of opportunity for this. And that's why it really depends on the institution, but many are moving in a direction where their safety and soundness from an operational risk perspective is going to be very much tied to how safe and sound their third parties are operating, which is going to put that much higher on the risk management category. But it's going to be an institution by institution perspective, and it's very much going to be dependent on what services are being outsourced and what's the inherent risk with some of those outsourcing arrangements. Again, with some of the new innovative fintech products and services, and either the ability to partner with those organizations, or let's face it, potential future competition, banks will need to be looking at constantly staying up with what are the latest products, services, and technologies that their customers are going to be demanding.
And likely, the larger the population, the more critical the dependency, the more value in quantitative risk measurement for this particular risk category going forward.
Again, if there can be greater standardization and ability to get that information, and again, I never want to move away from there's going to be that qualitative assessment that's necessary, but the ability to get that information and measure it consistently and measure it over time to provide yourself with a history that helps inform your forward view is, I think, very important.
Kevin, we're almost out of time. Is there anything you'd like to leave as a departing note for our audience today?
I would just leave is continue to focus on, again, how you measure risk, how you continue to use both qualitative and quantitative factors, and how do you identify those highest risk areas. I can tell you from our perspective, or at least looking at mine, is clearly from an operational risk, we're very focused on operational resilience, how you measure cybersecurity or security risks, and what impact that has on the bank's resilience and your ability to recover from those. And that third-party risk management element. More and more, the safety and soundness of the banks and the banking industry is going to be very much dependent on some of these service providers as we see greater specialization and economies of scale with outsourcing to these organizations for some of the more critical operations.
It's been a pleasure visiting with Kevin Greenfield today. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Pleasure.